Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a really fascinating, highly charged segment of Sky News Australia commentary. The source material we're unpacking focuses on the shifting dynamics of minor populist parties in Australia, specifically what the commentator describes as an absolute orange tsunami surrounding Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party. Now, whether you follow Australian politics religiously or you're just interested in how political messaging actually works, this explainer is going to break down exactly how this specific media source frames the current political landscape. And remember, we'll be looking at the information exactly as they presented it. You know, the commentator anchors their entire argument around this one very specific idea, that the established political parties, both the ruling Labour Party and the opposition coalition, are basically in a blind panic. According to the segment, this panic is a direct reaction to the reported rapid momentum of One Nation. As you'll see throughout the source material, pretty much every piece of data, every quote, and every little anecdote is used to reinforce this central thesis, that the major players are allegedly terrified of a rising populist tide. To make sense of all this dense commentary, we're going to use a sort of ripple effect structure today. First, the orange tsunami surge. Second, the $3 million haul. Third, major parties react. Fourth, media clashes and controversies. And finally, redrawing the battle lines.
All right, let's dive into Section 1, the orange tsunami surge.
So let's look at the baseline data the segment uses to establish One Nation's current footprint. The source builds its case by juxtaposing two very different types of momentum. They start with a hard fact. Back in the May 2022 federal election, One Nation polled just over 6% of the primary vote. But from there, the commentator paints a picture of a party dealing with intense opposition while simultaneously surging in relevance. For instance, on one hand, you've got recent logistical hurdles, like a fundraiser in Moonee Ponds, Melbourne, that literally had to be relocated at the very last minute due to safety fears and protesters. But on the other hand, the segment highlights massive institutional visibility, like Pauline Hanson being scheduled to address the National Press Club. And maybe most aggressively, the commentator makes the bold claim that depending on which polls you read, the party is now actually tracking ahead of the major parties federally.
Moving right along to Section 2, the $3 million haul.
According to the Sky News segment, One Nation didn't just see a bump in the polls, they experienced a massive financial windfall. The source heavily emphasizes that the party raised over $3 million. And get this, they did it in just 2 days, a 48-hour period. That massive number is really used by the host as the primary piece of evidence to validate the whole idea that an orange tsunami is genuinely happening right now.
And wow, did this ever spark some immediate friction right at the top. This segment brilliantly illustrates how quickly this financial news turned into top-level political drama. When asked about an initial report of a $2 million burst of cash, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese directly questioned the validity of those figures, flat out asking, what evidence is there? In response, the source details how Pauline Hanson aggressively defended the haul. She called it very legitimate, and to counter the Prime Minister's skepticism, she publicly committed to bringing in an independent auditor to go straight through the receipts.
So, you might be wondering, where did all this cash actually come from? Well, the commentator notes that this financial momentum is partially fueled by some highly provocative merchandise directly targeting the Prime Minister. They're utilizing a borrowed slogan, "Fire the liar." The segment points out the real irony here, noting that this merchandise is selling like crazy, even though the Speaker of the House, Milton Dick, explicitly banned the use of the word liar during question time in Parliament. It's a deliberate provocation, for sure.
Okay, let's shift to Section 3, Major Parties React.
The segment highlights this striking quote from Victorian Deputy Premier Ben Carroll to show how state-level leaders are going on the offensive. Carroll absolutely pulls no punches here. He labels the party's history as polarizing and, at times, racist, accusing Hanson of devising a divisive populist approach. Now, the Sky News commentator frames this quote not just as standard criticism, but as actual evidence of that blind panic we discussed earlier. The suggestion is that Carroll is teeing off on the parties specifically because he's eyeing the upcoming state election and views them as a very real threat.
Then the explainer shifts gears to the federal level, bringing in former Treasurer Wayne Swan. Swan attacks One Nation's working-class branding, essentially calling it a smokescreen, and claiming they're actually run by and deliver policies for the top end of town.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how the Sky News host immediately pushes back on this critique. The commentator basically scoffs at it, pointing out the irony of Wayne Swan criticizing the top end of town when Swan himself now sits as the chairman of a massive superannuation fund.
And rounding out this wave of political reactions, the segment points to the current treasurer, Jim Chalmers. Chalmers took aim at the party by attributing their whole direction to the influence of a prominent billionaire. According to the source, Chalmers claimed to his party faithful that One Nation and Pauline Hanson take their writing instructions from mining magnate Gina Rinehart. The commentator notes that critics continually point to the fact that Rinehart donated the use of a small plane to help Hanson reach remote parts of outback Queensland and New South Wales.
This brings us to Section 4, Media Clashes and Controversies.
It's not just rival politicians getting involved. The commentary also directs significant criticism at the mainstream media's handling of the minor party leader. The host zeroes in on a really tense exchange at Perth Airport involving a Channel 9 reporter. During this confrontation, the reporter repeatedly badgered Hanson, asking if Gina's jet is broken and asking if she had to fly cattle class. The Sky News commentator argues that this is a prime example of out-of-touch, disrespectful journalism. They make the explicit point that the media would never, ever dare ask the Prime Minister or his cabinet ministers if they were flying cattle class.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, redrawing the battle lines.
So, what does this all mean on the ground?
The crucial point the source makes is that geographical traditional battle lines are fundamentally shifting. They specifically single out the western suburbs of Melbourne. The traditional view of this landscape is that these are rusted-on supporters of the Labour government, areas that have been super reliable but perhaps long ignored. However, the segment's major claim is that this loyalty is finally broken, and that these historically safe working-class voters are now walking in droves to One Nation.
And, well, we're going to find out if that claim holds water pretty soon. The segment outlines 3 specific upcoming hurdles where we'll see the true electoral impact of this alleged orange tsunami. First up is the Victorian state election on November 28th. Next is the New South Wales election in March. And finally, the ultimate test, the next federal election, which could be up to 2 years away. The source firmly insists that the damage being done to the Liberal National Coalition is very real, and that One Nation is currently marching right through what used to be considered completely safe Labour seats. Which leaves us with this final, overarching question presented by the commentary we analyzed today. Are the days of safe seats just over for Australia's major political parties? If the financial surges, the political panic, and the shifting geography described in the Sky News segment are accurate, we might literally be watching a permanent rewriting of the Australian political map. It's a fascinating look at how political momentum is framed, contested, and ultimately battled over. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this source material, and I hope this explainer gave you a really clear, structured view of the commentary.